With all the controversy that has surrounded the BBC in the last few years, I don't think I should be too surprising that the one that seems to have brought the most ire down on them involves football. So, yeah, I'm just going to talk about what's been going on at the BBC, just straight up. And I'm not really going to put a lot of pretense on this. I've talked about the BBC openly before, and obviously it impacts things in terms of how I continue to deal with Doctor Who, because the BBC, obviously my issues with the BBC have largely centered around their very open and unapologetic transphobia, continually platforming gender critical turf talking points and figureheads over and over and over again, while downplaying, minimizing, silencing, and ignoring the voices of trans people. Literally ignoring. There were protests outside their offices that they ignored and did not acknowledge. But the BBC stepped in it. And the situation I am about to talk about, if you aren't already aware of what happened, well, I'll bring you up to speed. But it has sort of been resolved. However, I think it's still worth talking about because it laid the hypocrisy in the current standing of the BBC bare. And the hypocrisy became undeniable. So, we're going to talk about a guy by the name of Gary Lineker. Now, Lineker was a professional football player for a while, but since 1999, he has been a presenter on Match of the Day. Now, that makes him the longest running presenter in the history of that program. He's been doing it a long time. He is well liked. He was suspended by the BBC, and he was suspended over a tweet. Now, on the one hand, you might find yourself going, oh, cancel culture again. No, not really. Because the idea of cancel culture, even setting aside the bastardized version that gets thrown around and hollered by the far right, what it is theoretically supposed to be is a swell of calls for accountability, from the general public that then is responded to. That's not what happened here at all. There wasn't a big outcry against that tweet. It was something that made clear his feelings on a political situation. And don't worry, we'll get into all this. And I'll give you the specifics. But the way the BBC responded was incredibly telling. So, there have been, amongst many other things, a lot of issues with the immigration into the UK and the UK's government's attempts to close and lock it down. That was honestly one of the big supposed promises of Brexit, was to have more control over their borders. And the right, the Tories, have been pushing fairly xenophobic narratives for a while. And there have been a lot of increasingly draconian policies in place, or calls for draconian policies when it comes to immigration. Now, specifically what he was calling out on Twitter is something called the illegal migration bill. The specific aspect of that he was really hammering on was that that bill would ban migrants who arrive on small boats, and it would prevent them from settling in Britain. Now, if you don't already realize, if someone has arrived on a small boat, like a rowboat, a canoe, something with maybe just a single outboard motor, they probably are in a rough situation. That is not a particularly safe way to try and arrive in the UK. It's a bit of a desperation move. Now, whether someone is actually in a situation that warrants that, that's kind of a case by case. But just as a general thing, that is one of the most dangerous ways to try and get there. So he made his feelings pretty clear about what he thinks about the attempts to just flatly ban anyone who arrives that way from being able to settle in the country, just blanketly, not case by case, not taking into consideration, just saying, you arrive on a small boat, you can't be here. That was the policy proposal, and he shared his thoughts. Now, his original tweet that started all this was a retweet of a video featuring Interior Minister Suella Braverman outlining the new bill and what it was going to do. And he simply stated, "Good heavens, this is beyond awful." And when people started pushing back on him on that, he then put out a second tweet, which appears to be the one that really rankled the BBC. Specifically, he said, "This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. Now, specifically, the basis under which the BBC justified that suspension had to do with their impartiality rules. Now, the impartiality rules are something I am familiar with because those were the same rules under which, for a time, the BBC forbade its employees from attending and participating in pride events because that was considered to be in breach of the impartiality rule. Now, in theory, the impartiality rules are there so that the people who are members of BBC's broadcast, specifically anyone related to anything in the news branch, are not pushing policy, only reporting facts. And that includes both in front of and away from the camera. These impartiality rules do dictate off-site behavior. So it's not just when they're in the office. If you didn't already know, freedom of speech in the UK is not guaranteed to the degree that it is in the US. And I won't go down the path of all the differences there, but if you didn't already know that, yeah. So those are the impartiality rules. Now, a big part of why this got called out a lot is because even if Lineker did break those rules, and he may have, as they're written, the fact that he was disciplined when so many right-wing figures who work at or freelance for the BBC repeatedly express their political views and their stances and their opinions on policy and don't get disciplined. This was all laid out incredibly well by Kava Solikol, who made reference to numerous people, current and past, who have been affiliated with, associated with, or employed by the BBC, who in their time there expressed right-wing policies.
Why is Alan Sugar allowed to say what he wants on Twitter about political matters? What about Jeremy Clarkson? He's got a column in The Sun. He frequently expressed political opinions which many people think are extreme.
And very much like what we saw when the BBC tried to wield the impartiality rules against the ability of its employees to celebrate pride events. Impartiality, though in theory being something that applies to all political views, is currently being wielded as a cudgel against anyone with more progressive views than the Tory party, i.e. the people currently in power. And that's not what these rules are for, but it's how they're being deployed, and it's how they're being used. And it's interesting that the BBC blinked. Tons of other sportscasters walked off. The BBC had to broadcast multiple sporting events just showing the match footage with no commentary because there was nobody there to give it. They all walked out. And by and large, the public seemed to feel like Lineker was, if not correct in his original assessments and what he said, not deserving of this treatment. And the BBC has ultimately not only restored him to his position, this is the part I love, because I don't know to a certainty if this was one of Lineker's demands for coming back. Given how stubborn the guy appears to be, I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't confirm this. But what is happening is not only is he coming back, the BBC is reassessing its impartiality rules. They wielded these rules as a weapon, and not only did it fail to work, because he didn't cave. What they want him to do was go, I'm sorry, please bring me back onto my show. I'll behave. And he didn't. He didn't. He has said throughout this entire thing, I stand by what I said. I take nothing back. And I will not reverse my position on this. And I will continue to say it publicly. He didn't budge an inch. They really thought he would. They wouldn't have suspended him if they knew that this was going to happen. They would have let him get away with it. Maybe unhappily. But if they'd known, they wouldn't have done this. Because it's not about applying the rules. It's about silencing criticism of the current government. It's not about actually being impartial. It's about slamming the door and cutting off and punishing someone who is employed by what is a government agency and who is apparently supposed to just shut up and toe the line. Don't complain. Don't criticize. And it's especially telling that the BBC let him openly on their programs criticize human rights concerns in Qatar when the World Cup was held there. So they're not against him criticizing a human rights issue in another country.
And this is the same Gary Lineker who's been allowed on the BBC to criticize the human rights record of Qatar.
That's not considered any kind of breach of the impartiality. Oh, those politics are somehow not something we have to worry about. Oh, you're criticizing your own country. Oh, you're criticizing the people currently in power. Oh, no. But oh, yes. He just stood his ground. He stood his ground and people rallied behind him. And the BBC has not only had to let him back, but now they're going to have to re-examine those rules. And I suspect when they rework them, they're going to be reworked in a way to still attempt to use them in the ways that they have, I suspect. But they're going to have to narrow the field because the broad strokes and how badly and unevenly they were applying these rules, it's been spotlighted now. They're not going to keep getting away with it. This shows the importance of standing ground. Because the reason BBC, and this is true of many US agencies, companies, etc. as well, fundamentally, philosophically, this is the same, is that these people will capitulate and say, okay. We'll give you what you want, person who is making a stand. We'll give you what you want, or we'll give you back the thing we took from you. But just don't talk about any of this ever again, okay? I don't know if it's as much a thing in the UK specifically, but non-disclosure agreements, they're huge in the US. Company will put someone through something horrendous, illegal even. They'll pay them a settlement and have them sign an NDA, and the company or the individuals within that company won't have to answer for it. And it can't be publicly known. And they bully people with that, with the promise of, well, it's either this or nothing. But they actually can't get away with that. Not all the time. Not in every situation. Unfortunately, a lot of times in the US, they can simply by threatening to tie things up in court forever because they have more money than individual people do. But if somebody has the means, if somebody can actually afford to just stand their ground, if somebody's got enough money, which clearly Gary Lineker does, and he was happy to kick back and just go, no, I'll wait. The beauty of somebody using their means for a purpose like this, because you have to be a person of means to pull that off. You do. Because if this had been, I don't know, a camera person, someone low level at the BBC had done this and been suspended, even if it was someone who was beloved on set, maybe there would have been a walkout or two, but that person wouldn't have been able to afford financially to keep being suspended. They need the job. They need the money. I I am kind of an eat the rich person at this point, but this is an example of somebody leaning on their means in a way that actually feels like it produced some good. Because by standing his ground for as long as he did, until they freaking broke, he got to just kick back, secure in the fact that he's well off enough to do it, and just wait them out. The BBC has always been a literal branch and arm of the current ruling government. And that has, over the years at various times, tilted the coverage of the news and the tone of it one way or the other. But the degree to which it's happening now exceeds what it's been before. This video, I'm mainly kind of gloating. I mean, it's not like the BBC is suddenly going to become better. The BBC getting better is going to be a long slog of a thing if it can even be done. But to see them break like this, given my issues ongoing and how long they've been going on with the organization, this was fun. This was fun to watch. To see them make a move that to them probably seemed very straightforward, to see it bite them in the ass, to see Lineker hold his ground, turn out to be way, way too stubborn, way more stubborn than their processes were accounting for, and to see them cave. Yeah, I won't lie, I'm gloating. Let me have this. For years now, the BBC has been a source of little more than infuriation for me. And they make my job difficult. And I like seeing them get their teeth kicked in on this. I just did. Not going to apologize for it. But what did you think about what went down? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't assist me that way, like, share, subscribe, also help me out. But don't worry too much about it. Ultimately, what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. This video wouldn't have been possible without my supporters over on Patreon, and I would especially like to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Imudelki, Yotha Boyd, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Bernabe Lax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Tim Price, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, David Hall, General Contact Unit Problem Child, Shayla Gourlay, and Rosalind Bennett. Thank you so much.